My name is Bertha, and I'm 55 years old. 3 years ago, I started writing my first book about single motherhood after my husband passed away. Last month, I finally held that finished book in my hands, feeling like I could conquer the world. I spent months planning the perfect launch event, imagining my 3 grown children cheering me on as I signed copies and shared my story. I pictured their proud faces in the crowd, finally seeing their mother not just as someone who cooked their meals and did their laundry, but as a real author with something meaningful to say. But sometimes the people who should celebrate us the most are the ones who hurt us deepest. Before I share what happened on what should have been the proudest day of my life, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe for more heartfelt stories about life's unexpected lessons. Now let me take you back to the beginning of this journey that taught me more about family than I ever wanted to know. You have to understand how I got to this point in my life to really grasp what this book meant to me. I've been a widow for 5 years now, raising 3 children who are all adults, but still feel like my babies. My oldest, Sarah, is 32 and works as a lawyer in downtown Chicago. She's always been the serious one, throwing herself into her career with the same determination she showed when she was captain of her high school debate team. Then there's Marcus, my 29-year-old son, who's a software engineer living about 2 hours away in Milwaukee. He's got that quiet, analytical mind that can solve any computer problem, but sometimes struggles with emotional connections. My youngest, Amanda, is 26 and works in marketing for a local company. She still lives close by, only about 15 minutes from my house, and she's always been my social butterfly. Writing had been my secret dream since I was a little girl. I used to fill notebook after notebook, but with stories about brave princesses and talking animals. But life happened the way it does for many women of my generation. I got married at 22, started having babies right away, and my notebooks got pushed to the back of closets, behind diaper bags and toy boxes. For 30 years, I poured all my creativity into raising my children, making Halloween costumes from scratch, writing elaborate birthday party invitations, and helping with school projects that required more imagination than most adults possess. When my husband died suddenly of a heart attack, I found myself alone for the first time in decades. After the funeral, flowers wilted and the casserole dishes were returned. I sat in my quiet house and realized I had no idea who I was without being someone's wife or someone's needed mother. That's when I rediscovered those old notebooks in the attic pages, yellowed with age, but dreams still intact. I decided to write about what I knew best, the challenges and triumphs of raising children, especially during those difficult years when I had to figure out how to be both mother and father after my husband's death. The book would be called Raising Strong Hearts, A Single Mother's Journey, and it would be my gift to other women struggling to balance their own needs with their children's demands. Every night after my shift at the public library where I work, I would come home, make myself a cup of tea, and sit at my kitchen table with my laptop. The words poured out of me like they'd been waiting decades to be released. I wrote about the time Sarah broke her arm, and I had to carry her to the emergency room alone. I wrote about Marcus's struggle with anxiety in middle school, and how we worked together to find coping strategies. I wrote about Amanda's teenage rebellion, and how I learned to pick my battles. When I shared my progress with my children during our weekly phone calls, they seemed genuinely interested. Sarah would ask about my word count. Marcus offered to help with technical formatting issues, and Amanda suggested I start an Instagram account to promote the book. Their encouragement fueled my late-night writing sessions, and I began to imagine the day I would hold a published book with my name on the cover. The night I typed the end on my final chapter, I called all 3 kids to share the news. Sarah squealed with excitement. Marcus said he was proud of my dedication, and Amanda immediately started talking about planning a launch party. For the first time since my husband died, I felt like I had accomplished something entirely my own. Finding a publisher turned out to be almost as challenging as writing the book itself. I researched agents and publishing houses, crafting query letters and synopses that I rewrote dozens of times. The rejection emails came steadily, each one a small punch to my confidence. Some were form letters that barely acknowledged my submission, while others offered vague feedback about the market being saturated with memoirs. Just when I was beginning to think my book would live forever on my computer hard drive, I received an email from Golden Prairie Publishing, a small independent press that specialized in women's stories. Jennifer Adams, the editor, wrote that my manuscript had moved her to tears and that she believed it would resonate with readers across the country. I must have read that email 20 times before I could believe it was real. Working with Jennifer over the next 6 months was like having a writing mentor and cheerleader rolled into one. She helped me strengthen weak chapters, cut unnecessary tangents, and polish my prose until it shone. We spent hours on video calls, discussing everything from chapter structure to the emotional arc of my story. She understood that this wasn't just a book for me. It was proof that starting over at 50 wasn't too late. Choosing the cover design became a family affair. Jennifer sent me 3 options, and I immediately fell in love with the one featuring a close-up photograph of a sunflower against a blue sky. The flower was slightly weathered, showing signs of having survived storms, but it stood tall and bright, facing the sun. It perfectly captured how I felt about my own journey through grief and single motherhood. Planning the launch event consumed my thoughts for weeks. I chose Books and Brew, a cozy, independent bookstore and coffee shop, where I'd spent countless hours reading to my children when they were small. The owner, Mrs. Patterson, had known our family for years and offered to host the event free of charge. We scheduled it for a Saturday afternoon in September, giving people time to browse, chat, and celebrate without feeling rushed. I threw myself into every detail with the enthusiasm of someone planning their first wedding. I ordered a sheet cake decorated with an edible image of my book cover. I arranged for folding chairs to be set up in the store's reading nook. I even bought a new dress for the occasion, a navy blue wrap style that made me feel both professional and maternal. Creating the invitations became my favorite task. Instead of ordering generic cards online, I bought beautiful cardstock and wrote each invitation by hand. For my colleagues at the library, I mentioned how much their support had meant during my writing process. For my neighbours, I thanked them for their patience during the months when I'd been too distracted by deadlines to maintain proper conversations over the fence. But the invitations for my children were special. I spent an entire evening crafting personal messages for each of them. Sarah's card read, "My dearest daughter, you have always inspired me to be a stronger woman. Your determination and intelligence gave me the courage to pursue this dream. I hope you'll be there to celebrate with me." Marcus's invitation said, "My wonderful son, your quiet strength and thoughtful nature taught me that love doesn't always need words. This book exists because you showed me that persistence pays off." Amanda's card was the most emotional. "My sweet baby girl, you have been my sunshine through every storm. Your enthusiasm for life reminded me that it's never too late to chase your dreams." When I handed each of them their invitations during separate visits, their reactions filled my heart. Sarah hugged me tightly and promised she wouldn't miss it for the world. Marcus, never one for dramatic displays of emotion, simply smiled and said he was proud of me. Amanda immediately started taking photos of her invitation to post on social media, declaring that her mum was going to be a famous author. In those weeks leading up to the launch, I felt like I was walking on air. After years of defining myself primarily through my relationships with others, I was about to step into an identity that belonged entirely to me. I was going to be Bertha the author, not just Bertha the mum or Bertha the widow or Bertha the librarian. My children seemed to understand the significance of this moment, and their support made everything feel perfect. The first crack in my perfect picture appeared 3 weeks before the launch date. I was shelving returns at the library when my phone buzzed with a call from Sarah. Her voice carried that slightly stressed tone I'd learned to recognize over the years, the one that meant she was juggling too many responsibilities at once. "Mum, I need to talk to you about your book thing," she said, and my stomach immediately tightened at her choice of words. Book thing, not book launch or book signing or celebration. Thing. Sarah explained that she had just been assigned to a major corporate lawsuit that required her to work weekends for the foreseeable future. The client was demanding the case was complex, and her law firm's biggest partnership decision was coming up next year. She couldn't afford to appear anything less than completely committed to her work. "I'm going to try my absolute hardest to be there, Mum," she said, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. "But if this case goes to emergency court sessions, or if depositions run long, I might not be able to make it. You understand, right? This is really important for my career." I told her I understood, of course I did. Even as disappointment settled in my chest like a stone. I'd raised my children to prioritize their responsibilities to work hard for their goals. How could I fault Sarah for applying those lessons to her own life? 2 weeks later, Marcus called with his own potential conflict. His software company was sending him to a conference in San Francisco that same weekend. It was a huge opportunity to network with industry leaders and potentially land a promotion he'd been working toward for months. "I'm trying to see if I can fly back early on Saturday morning," he said, his voice crackling through what sounded like a poor cell connection. "But you know how flights are these days, and if the conference runs late on Friday night, I might not make it in time. I really want to be there, Mum. Your book is such a big deal." Again, I found myself saying I understood while fighting back tears. Marcus had struggled to find his place in the competitive tech world, and this conference could change his career trajectory. How could I ask him to choose between my book launch and his future? The final blow came from Amanda, delivered with characteristic dramatic flair during one of our regular Thursday evening phone calls. She'd been invited to serve as maid of honor at her college roommate Jessica's wedding, and the bachelorette party had been scheduled for the same weekend as my launch. "It's this whole spa weekend thing," Amanda explained, her voice bright with excitement that made my heart sink further. "Jessica's been planning it for months, and she specifically asked for that weekend because it was the only time all the bridesmaids could get together. We're going to this amazing resort about 2 hours north of here. There's going to be massages and facials and this incredible dinner at a 5-star restaurant." The way she described the spa weekend with such enthusiasm and detail highlighted the casual way she'd referred to my event. She hadn't even remembered the specific date until I reminded her, and then she'd gasped dramatically and promised she would try to figure something out. As I hung up the phone that night, I sat in my quiet kitchen staring at the stack of books I'd ordered for the launch. 50 copies of my own work waiting to be signed and shared with the people who mattered most to me. For the first time since I'd started writing, I wondered if this whole endeavor had been a foolish, middle-aged fantasy. I tried to rationalize their conflicts. They were adults with important careers and social obligations. I'd raised them to be independent and ambitious. Their lives couldn't revolve around their mother's schedule, especially for something that might seem small in comparison to career opportunities and wedding celebrations. But late that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd somehow taught them that my dreams were always secondary to everyone else's needs. Had I modeled self-sacrifice so well that they'd learned to take my devotion for granted? The night before my launch, I barely slept. I kept checking my phone, hoping for a last-minute message from one of them saying they'd found a way to attend after all. Instead, I found only silence and the growing realization that I might be celebrating the biggest accomplishment of my adult life, surrounded by virtual strangers. Saturday morning arrived grey and drizzly, matching my increasingly somber mood. I'd set my alarm for 5 in the morning, giving myself plenty of time to prepare for the 2 o'clock event. I wanted everything to be perfect, even if the people who mattered most wouldn't be there to see it. I'd chosen my outfit carefully the week before, the navy dress that made me feel confident, paired with my grandmother's pearl necklace and the small diamond earrings my husband had given me for our 20th anniversary. Looking at myself in the mirror, I tried to channel the excitement I'd felt just days earlier, but anxiety had settled in my stomach like lead. My phone remained stubbornly silent as I ate breakfast and double-checked my supplies for the event. No good luck messages, no last-minute changes of plan, no miraculous solutions that would bring my children to my side. I told myself this was normal, that they were busy adults who didn't need to check in with their mother constantly. I arrived at Books and Brew 2 hours early, my car loaded with boxes of books, the decorated cake, and a folder full of bookmarks I'd designed myself. Mrs. Patterson helped me arrange everything in the store's cozy reading area, transforming the familiar space into something that looked almost professional. She'd even created a small display of other books about motherhood and personal growth, making my book feel like part of a larger literary conversation. As I set up my signing table and tested the microphone Mrs. Patterson had borrowed from the community centre, I felt a flutter of the old excitement. This was really happening. I was about to become a published author with an actual book event. Even if my children couldn't be there, I still had friends and colleagues who wanted to celebrate with me. 1 hour before the scheduled start time, my phone finally buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Mom, so sorry. Case went to emergency court session this morning. Judge called weekend hearing. Can't make it, but so proud of you. Will buy 10 copies online tonight." The formal tone of her message, with its emphasis on the legal emergency, felt like a business email rather than a daughter's apology. I understood that emergency court sessions were beyond her control, but part of me wondered if she could have found a way to attend if it had been her own book launch. 30 minutes later, Marcus called while I was arranging the last of my books on the display table. "Mum, I'm so sorry," he began, and I could hear airport announcement sounds in the background. "My flight got delayed because of weather in Denver. I'm stuck here for at least 6 more hours. I feel terrible about missing your big day. I'll buy a bunch of copies for my coworkers and tell everyone about your book." His voice carried genuine regret, and I could picture him pacing around an airport terminal, frustrated by circumstances beyond his control. Weather delays were nobody's fault. But the timing felt cruel in a way that made me question whether the universe was conspiring against this event. The final call came just 15 minutes before the official start time. I was standing next to my display, watching the first few guests trickle in, when Amanda's name appeared on my phone screen. My heart leaped with hope that maybe she'd found a way to leave the spa early, that she'd realized how important this was to me. Instead, her voice carried the guilty tone of someone who knew they were disappointing someone they loved. "Mum, I'm so sorry. We're at the spa right now getting massages, and I completely lost track of time. This whole weekend has been so relaxing, and we haven't even gotten to the dinner part yet. Jessica would be devastated if I left early. Can you do another book signing soon so I can come to that one instead?" The casualness of her suggestion, the assumption that I could simply schedule another first book launch, hit me harder than her absence. I managed to say something appropriate about understanding and having fun, but as I hung up the phone, I felt hollow inside. Standing there in my special dress, surrounded by carefully arranged books and homemade decorations, I realized that my children had made their priorities clear. Sarah had her emergency court case, which I could accept as truly unavoidable. But Marcus had chosen a conference over his mother's milestone, and Amanda had chosen a spa day with friends over witnessing her mother's literary debut. The event began with about 20 people in attendance, colleagues from the library, a few neighbours, Mrs. Patterson and her husband, and several members of the local book club who'd heard about the event through word of mouth. They were lovely, enthusiastic people who asked thoughtful questions about my writing process and shared their own stories about single motherhood and pursuing dreams later in life. But as I read excerpts from my book and answered questions about my inspiration, I kept glancing at the door, hoping against hope that one of my children might surprise me by showing up late. When someone asked if my family was there, I had to explain that they had various commitments that prevented them from attending, trying to keep my voice steady as I spoke. The signing portion of the event was bittersweet. Each person who bought a book shared kind words about my story and my courage in pursuing publication at this stage of life. Their genuine enthusiasm should have filled the hole my children's absence had created. But instead, their kindness only highlighted how alone I felt in what should have been a moment of triumph. As the last guest left and Mrs. Patterson helped me pack up the remaining books, I couldn't escape the feeling that I'd experienced a hollow victory. I'd achieved my dream of becoming a published author, but the people whose opinions mattered most had found other things more worthy of their time. That night, I sat alone in my living room with a stack of unsold books and a piece of cake I'd brought home from the event. The house felt impossibly quiet, filled with the echo of conversations that should have happened but didn't. I'd imagined coming home energized and fulfilled, ready to call my children and share every detail of the afternoon. Instead, I felt like I'd been performing for an audience that didn't include the people I most wanted to impress. Around 10 o'clock, Amanda finally called, her voice bright and cheerful, in a way that made my chest tighten with unexpressed anger. "Mom, how was your book thing? Did you sell lots of copies? Was it everything you hoped it would be?" The casual way she referred to it as my book thing, again combined with her obvious good mood, from her spa weekend, broke something inside me that I'd been trying to hold together all day. "You chose a spa day over your mother's once-in-a-lifetime moment," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Mum, you're being a little dramatic," Amanda replied, and I could practically hear her rolling her eyes. "It was just a book signing. You said yourself that you might do more events in the future. Besides, this was Jessica's bachelorette party. I couldn't just abandon my responsibilities as her maid of honor." Just a book signing. The words came out louder than I'd meant them to. Amanda, this was 3 years of my life. This was my dream finally coming true after decades of putting everyone else's needs first. This was supposed to be my day. The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably long before Amanda spoke again, her voice now defensive and slightly hurt. "I didn't know it was that big of a deal to you. You always told us that family comes first, and Jessica is like family to me. I thought you'd understand that." 20 minutes later, Sarah called, having clearly been contacted by Amanda about our conversation. Her lawyer voice was in full effect, calm and measured in a way that made me feel like I was being handled rather than heard. "Mum, I understand you're disappointed that we couldn't be there today," she began. "But you have to understand that sometimes life presents us with conflicts we can't control. My court case could determine whether my client loses millions of dollars. Surely you can see that attending to my professional responsibilities had to take priority." "Professional responsibilities," I repeated, tasting the bitter irony of her words. "What about family responsibilities, Sarah? What about supporting your mother when she accomplishes something important?" Marcus called an hour later from his hotel room in San Francisco, his voice heavy with guilt, but also touched with defensiveness. Mum, I'm really sorry about today. I know my timing was terrible, but this conference is huge for my career. I've been working toward this kind of opportunity for years. I thought you'd be proud that I was taking initiative in my professional life. As I hung up after that third conversation, I sat in the darkness of my living room and faced a painful truth I'd been avoiding all day. This wasn't really about scheduling conflicts or competing priorities. This was about the fact that I'd raised three children who fundamentally didn't view their mother's dreams and accomplishments as important enough to prioritize. I thought back over the years, remembering all the times I'd rearranged my schedule to attend their school plays, sports games, graduation ceremonies, and work celebrations. I'd driven hours to be present for Amanda's college sorority events, taken vacation days to help Sarah move between apartments, and flown to Milwaukee to celebrate Marcus's job promotions. When had I taught them that love was a one-way street? The most painful realization was that this pattern wasn't new. I'd been making excuses for their absence from my life for years. When I'd thrown myself a small birthday party after turning 50, only Amanda had shown up, and that was because she lived close by. When I'd celebrated 5 years of sobriety from the depression that followed my husband's death, none of them had acknowledged the milestone. When I'd received recognition at work for developing a new children's literacy program, I'd had to share the news with them over the phone because none of them had attended the ceremony. I'd convinced myself that these absences were normal, that adult children naturally became absorbed in their own lives. But sitting there with my first published book in my lap and tears on my cheeks, I finally understood that I'd become invisible to the people I'd spent my life serving. The saddest part was recognizing my own role in creating this dynamic. I'd been so determined to raise independent, ambitious children that I'd never taught them about reciprocal love. I'd modeled endless self-sacrifice without ever showing them how to honor the sacrifices others made for them. I'd been such a devoted mother that I'd forgotten to teach them how to be devoted children. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done waiting for my children to validate my worth. I was done shrinking my accomplishments to make room for their indifference. I was 55 years old, and it was time to start living for the woman I'd become, rather than the mother I'd always been. The week following my book launch, I did something I'd never done before. I didn't call any of my children for our usual check-ins. When Sarah called on Tuesday evening to ask how my week was going, I kept the conversation brief and focused on her life, rather than sharing my feelings about the weekend. When Marcus texted on Thursday to ask if I was still upset about the book event, I simply responded that I was busy with work. Instead of dwelling on their absence, I threw myself into promoting my book with an energy that surprised even me. I reached out to the 3 book clubs in our area and arranged to attend their upcoming meetings. I contacted the local newspaper and pitched them a story about late-blooming authors in our community. I even set up a basic website and started a blog about writing and single motherhood. The response was more positive than I'd dared to hope. Within 2 weeks of my launch, I'd sold nearly 100 copies through word-of-mouth recommendations and online orders. Readers began emailing me through my website, sharing their own stories of starting over after loss and pursuing dreams that had been delayed by life's demands. One particularly moving email came from a woman named Patricia in Oregon, who had also lost her husband and was raising teenage children alone. She wrote that my book had given her permission to start taking art classes again, something she'd abandoned when she became a mother 20 years earlier. Another reader, Dorothy from Texas, shared that she'd been inspired to finally write the memoir about her grandmother that she'd been planning for a decade. The local newspaper, the Prairie Tribune, ran a feature story about my book in their Sunday lifestyle section. The headline read, "Local Librarian Becomes Published Author at 55." And the article included a photograph of me standing next to the sunflower display in my own backyard. The reporter, a young woman named Kate, had asked thoughtful questions about writing later in life and pursuing dreams that had been deferred. When the article was published, I experienced something I'd never felt before: pride in myself that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. Seeing my name in print, reading quotes from my interview about the importance of reinvention at any age, I felt like I was meeting myself for the first time as an individual, rather than in relation to someone else. The children's reactions to my newfound visibility were telling. Sarah called after seeing a colleague share the newspaper article on social media, her voice carrying a note of surprise and what might have been respect. "Mom, I had no idea your book was getting this kind of attention. Why didn't you tell me about the newspaper interview?" "I learned not to expect others to prioritize what matters to me," I replied calmly, without anger, but also without the eager-to-please tone I'd used with them for years. When Amanda suggested organizing a belated celebration party for my book, complete with decorations and a guest list of family friends, I politely declined. "I don't need a pity party, Amanda. I needed you when it mattered." Marcus, clearly feeling guilty about missing the original event, ordered 50 copies of my book to distribute among his colleagues and friends. While I appreciated the gesture, I told him honestly that sales numbers couldn't replace the experience of having my family present during my moment of achievement. The most significant change wasn't in their behavior, though, but in my own perspective. I began to understand that my worth as a person wasn't determined by how much attention my children paid to my accomplishments. I'd spent so many years defining success through their happiness and achievements that I'd forgotten how to measure my own value independently. I started attending monthly meetings of a regional writers group, connecting with other people who understood the challenges and joys of the creative process. I made new friends who were interested in discussing books and ideas rather than just family updates and shared memories. For the first time in decades, I was developing relationships based on who I was becoming rather than who I'd been. As autumn progressed, I began working on my second book. This one focused on rediscovering identity after major life changes. The words came more easily this time, flowing from a place of hard-won wisdom rather than raw pain. I wrote about the difference between loving someone and losing yourself in that love, about the importance of teaching children to honor their parents' humanity, and about the freedom that comes from refusing to shrink yourself to accommodate other people's limitations. My relationship with my children evolved into something more honest, but also more distant. They began to treat my writing career with respect, asking about my progress and sharing news of my success with their friends. But I no longer sought their approval or shaped my decisions around their convenience. When they visited, we talked about my work alongside updates about their lives, and I no longer automatically centered our conversations around their needs and interests. The woman who had been devastated by their absence at my book launch was transforming into someone who could love them without needing them to validate her existence. It was a painful but necessary evolution, one that required me to grieve the relationship I'd thought we had while building something more sustainable in its place. 6 months after my book launch, I found myself in a position I'd never imagined possible: success that belonged entirely to me. Raising Strong Hearts had sold over 2,000 copies, mostly through online orders and recommendations from readers who connected with its message. I'd been invited to speak at 3 different conferences about women's writing and late-life career changes. The second book was taking shape beautifully, with a publisher already expressing interest based on sample chapters and my growing reputation in the memoir market. I'd discovered that I had a voice that resonated with other women who were navigating the complex territory between selfless devotion and healthy independence. My relationship with my children had settled into a new normal that felt both more honest and more distant than before. They now treated my writing career as a legitimate part of my identity rather than a hobby that competed with my availability to them. When they called, they asked about my book sales and upcoming events alongside the usual family updates. The first major test of our changed dynamic came during Thanksgiving. As we gathered around my dining room table, the same table where I'd written much of my first book, the atmosphere felt different from previous years. There was an underlying tension, an awareness that something fundamental had shifted in our family structure. Sarah, ever the lawyer, attempted to address the elephant in the room with characteristic directness. Mum, I want you to know that we've all learned something important from what happened with your book launch. We didn't fully understand how significant it was to you. Amanda, fidgeting with her napkin, added quietly, I keep thinking about how excited you were when you gave me that invitation and how I just didn't prioritize it the way I should have. Marcus, typically more reserved, simply said, We messed up, Mum. We're sorry. I looked at my 3 children, these adults I'd raised to be confident and successful, and felt a complex mixture of love and sadness. Their apologies were sincere, but they came too late to undo the lesson I'd learned about my place in their lives. I appreciate your apologies. I told them, and I forgive you for missing that day. But I also learned something important about myself. I learned that I can't depend on any of you for my happiness or sense of worth. That's not your job, and it wasn't fair of me to expect it. The conversation that followed was difficult, but necessary. We talked about how my years of self-sacrifice had created an imbalance in our relationships, how they'd learned to take my devotion for granted because I'd never required them to reciprocate in meaningful ways. We discussed the difference between loving someone and enabling them to treat you poorly, even unintentionally. Amanda cried during part of the discussion, finally understanding how her casual dismissal of my book thing had revealed a deeper lack of respect for my independent identity. Sarah acknowledged that she'd always assumed I would be available and supportive, regardless of how little attention she paid to my own needs and dreams. Marcus admitted that he'd never really considered what I might need from him as an adult son. But I also took responsibility for my role in creating these patterns. I'd been so determined to be the perfect supportive mother that I'd never taught them how to support me in return. I'd modeled endless availability without ever demonstrating the importance of boundaries or mutual consideration. The healing that began that Thanksgiving wasn't quick or simple. Learning to love my children without losing myself required constant vigilance against old patterns of self-sacrifice. Teaching them to see me as a complete person rather than just their mother required patience as they adjusted to this new version of our relationship. But the woman who sat at that table discussing her second book contract and upcoming speaking engagements was fundamentally different from the woman who had sat alone after her book launch 6 months earlier. I'd found my voice not just as a writer, but as a person who deserved respect and consideration from the people she loved. I started a new tradition that year, one that honored my own achievements rather than waiting for others to celebrate them. Each time I reached a writing milestone or received recognition for my work, I bought myself flowers and took time to acknowledge my own efforts. I learned to be my own most reliable supporter. My writing group became like a second family, a community of people who understood the challenges and rewards of creative work. We celebrated each other's publications, commiserated over rejections, and provided the kind of intellectual companionship I'd been missing for years. The children adapted to this new version of their mother, gradually, sometimes with confusion or resistance, but ultimately with growing respect. They began to understand that my love for them didn't require me to diminish myself, and that their love for me should include honoring my individual worth. As I worked on my second book, tentatively titled Finding Yourself After 50, A Guide to Late Life Renaissance, I drew heavily from the lessons of that painful but transformative period. I wrote about the importance of teaching our children to honor our humanity, about the difference between unconditional love and unconditional availability, and about the courage required to demand respect from people who have learned to take you for granted. The woman who had once defined herself entirely through her relationships with others had discovered the power of standing alone. Not alone because I was unloved, but alone in my sense of worth and purpose. It was a hard-won independence that made my love for my children more honest and my expectations of them more reasonable. My book launch had taught me the most valuable lesson of my adult life. The most important audience I would ever have was the woman looking back at me in the mirror each morning, and finally, beautifully, she approved of what she saw. Have you ever felt invisible to the people who matter most to you? Have you found yourself giving endlessly while receiving little recognition in return? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about finding balance between loving others and honoring yourself. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear these words. Subscribe for more stories about life's unexpected lessons and the strength we discover in ourselves when we stop waiting for others to validate our worth. Remember, it's never too late to become the author of your own story, and you deserve an audience that truly sees and celebrates you. Thank you for listening to my journey, and may you find the courage to prioritize your own dreams alongside your love for others.